It's one of the first big examples of the administration thinking about taxing a service.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in U.S. news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement and Impact at the United States Study Center. Thanks for joining us on the USSC Briefing Room today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. When President Trump's war on international trade barriers kicked off, the sweeping scale and scope of his tariffs were staggering. But even after Liberation Day, there's one proposed tariff that seems to have caught many by surprise: the 100% tariff on any U.S. films produced in other countries. From The Matrix to The Fall Guy, Australia has been a destination of choice for many U.S. films. So what sort of impact could these proposed tariffs have on Australia's film industry? How does President Trump view this as a national security issue? How should international film industry businesses respond? To discuss these issues, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Mike Seymour, a senior lecturer in the business school at the University of Sydney, onto the podcast today. His work focuses on the digital transformation of creative industries and the future of media production. He spent 2 decades in the visual effects and post-production industry, earning an AFI award and an Emmy nomination for his work. Mike, thank you so much for joining me today.
All right, thank you. Greatly appreciate being here.
And at the end of the episode, we'll get your by the numbers stat. I'm looking forward to hearing what that is. So I'll just get going with a look at how this all started. President Trump kicked off his focus on international film production with a post on his social media platform, Truth Social, that said, "This is a concerted effort by other nations and therefore a national security threat. It is, in addition to everything else, messaging and propaganda," end quote. He called on various government agencies to begin work on a 100% tariff on all films produced abroad. Mike, can you talk us through a little bit about where this came from and how that became something that he would both post about and then get government agencies working on right away?
Sure. Well, I can't really speak to exactly where this particular aspect came from the president, other than to say he had set up a group of 3 to be special ambassadors to the president. And so for a while there, we heard nothing from these 3, and we sort of assumed that it was almost an honorary position. But apparently that wasn't the case. One of the 3 went to great lengths to actually take that role very seriously and started talking to people in Hollywood and in the film studios, the unions, etc., to try and work out a plan that would enable the film industry in America, and in particular in California, to grow again and prosper at a way that we need to consider at sort of like almost a grassroots level, because it's not the case that the film industry itself at the studio level has been sort of incredibly adversely affected by what the president was pointing to. And this in of itself highlights the real complexity of what this issue is all about, is that at one level, you've got the studios, which, let's face it, are making money from overseas tax incentives. In other words, they're the recipients of our tax dollars. They are being subsidized when they get tax incentives. And at the other level, there is the loss of jobs, the almost blue-collar worker type jobs of sort of craft and technicians, people actually making films on the streets of, say, Los Angeles. And so the idea was to bring back the jobs, and that's what proposal was that he presented to the president, we believe, at Mar-a-Lago.
Okay. Well, that's interesting, because I guess the contrast between what's happened as the film industry has thrived abroad versus what has happened. If you think of the golden age of Hollywood, and if you've been to Hollywood any time in the last 40 plus years, it really does not match what a lot of the perceptions are. So much of the business has left, and it looks like any other city where businesses leave. It's quite derelict. And so I guess if he's focused just on that image of what Hollywood was, and then if you just see, okay, that's so different, and he would want to change that, maybe it's almost an emotive, visceral reaction.
Well, it's interesting that you say that. It is true that when you are in LA, and I used to work in Hollywood,
Mm.
that the amount of local production is down dramatically. It's
Oh,
down for a number of reasons, not least of which was the writer's strike, the actors' strike,
oh,
COVID, but also because there's been this internationalization, these what's called runaway productions that have moved to other parts of the world. But again, it isn't that the businesses that are based in Hollywood, in primarily in California, are necessarily um, gone incredibly poorly because Disney, is still a major corporation and has massive amounts of IP infrastructure and diverse businesses. So, it's true that you've got a change at the production level, but you haven't necessarily sort of can point to the overseas work as contributing to the structural issues that the parent companies are facing. Because the parent companies are facing completely non overseas tariff related problems, such as the advent of streaming, the growth of YouTube, a whole lot of other factors that are separate from this international trade example.
yeah, that's a really good point. But there has been a trend toward international filmmaking or production on a number of different
Absolutely.
levels. So, how big a deal is international filmmaking? What sort of economic impact has that side of it had on the US film industry?
So there has been a huge range of incentives offered by countries such as New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and England, to just name four, that have caused companies to want to both film overseas and then do their post production overseas. Now, if you take any film, the reason for shooting overseas isn't just economic, and you only have to sort of queue up at the cinemas this coming weekend for Mission Impossible to see
Oh,
that they shoot all over the world because that makes for an interesting film, right? And the next James Bond film will no doubt shoot all over the world because that's what we expect out of a James Bond film. But that being said, productions have moved to places like, well, out of California to places like Georgia inside the United States, which actually has replicas of the White House that are permanently built so that you can film there, as well as going to places like Canada, where tax incentives have meant that it's more profitable to film. And of course, we all know that New Zealand's been incredibly successful, not only based off the Lord of the Rings work that Peter Jackson initially did, but more recently, in addition to spectacular other work that they've done, they're doing the Jim Cameron Avatar series of films, which are some of the biggest blockbusters we've ever seen. Australia, by the same token, has done its own fair share of attracting productions, and Fox Studios, which became part of Disney, has been host to things from Star Wars. Going back even further, there was The Matrix, and then more recently, big films like Fall Guy and stuff. So there has been production moving internationally, and that's been going on, I'm going to say now, for like decades.
yeah. And I mean, Australia's been quite successful in wooing these big major films to come film there. But it even aside from the economic incentives and making it interesting movie, I just imagine it'd be a far more preferable experience for some of the big talent that's involved in the film to spend, months in, Byron Bay area versus months on a soundstage in Burbank. So it would be a different experience all around. There's a number of things that would draw people to want to come and film in different locations. In what ways do you think that Australia contributes to US films beyond just being a filming destination? Because I remember from when Happy Feet was a big movie, I guess that'd be nearly 20 years ago now. But there was a lot of talk about the role that, George Miller and other Australians played in that movie. So when it's not just about the filming, what other parts of the film industry really thrive here?
Well, it's been a really interesting evolution. As you pointed out, George Miller had a series of films that were what you'd call international films that were based here. Originally, of course, something like Mad Max was an Australian film, but the more recent Mad Max films have been what you'd call sort of classic Hollywood type films, happen to have been shot in Australia because George Miller is a proud Australian and there's very good talent both in front of and behind the camera in Australia. Generally speaking, we tend to think of this as like above and below the line. Above the line being the actors, the the Chris's, as they were referred to, Chris Hemsworth, etc. Um, and and for those actors, they've had a lot of success in Hollywood. We have very, very good actors and actresses that have won Oscars, and rightfully so, for doing really great work internationally, even when they're not playing Australians. But then below the line, we've also had a very, very strong contribution, especially in the area of DOPs, so
Huh.
directors of photographies, which is kind of the how can I put this? It's almost like the most senior below the line technical role. That's the one that, on set, if you're not looking to the director, you look to the DOP, right? That's the person that anyone technical is taking the lead from. And spreading out from that, visual effects specialists, and there have been great contributions to that area. That's an area I know really well. And we've seen people like Andrew Jackson who've gone on to work with Christopher Nolan and other greats around the world, because Australian talent, highly educated and very good problem solvers.
Mm. So, what sort of impact would a 100% tariff on films produced internationally have on Australia and its film industry?
Well, I guess the answer to that question is I need to ask you a question. Do you want the sort of 10,000 feet kind of thing, or the more detailed answer? Because they're two quite different perspectives.
Yeah, why not both?
Okay, well, the first thing is, at face value, the post on Truth Social is very unusual, and I'm just speaking economically now, because it's a tariff effectively on a service. Because if you think about it, if I'm importing T-shirts from China, they arrive at the port, it has a value, it's a $10 T-shirt, and I'm going to charge $10 tariff on it. It's very clear because it's coming through a port as a physical commodity. That is not the case with a film, because what am I doing? I'm charging the upload of data from one computer to another as it goes across the high speed internet for transferring a film back into the US. I mean, it makes no sense, right? It's one of the first big examples of the administration thinking about taxing a service, because they're
Oh,
clearly not talking about taxing, I don't know, DVDs, because that's really not a thing anymore, right? So you can't tax the thing at the port because there is no port, there is no point of entry for a digital product. The
huh.
replication costs of a digital item are virtually zero. So there's no sort of per unit cost that you could possibly tax. So therefore, it's some notional tax on the film itself as a service that's been provided to produce this thing that we call entertainment. And if you go further, it would make no sense to take it at face value and say it's just for film. Because it was just for film and just on the budget. So I made a $40 million film in Australia. I would have to pay $40 million additionally to the US government as a tariff, thus taking the budget to 80 million. That would double the cost of that film, which means cinemas would suddenly have to make a lot more money to recoup the cost of the film, and a $300 million film made overseas would suddenly be $600 million. And so all cinema chains in the US would have to jack their prices up. It would lead to the collapse of cinema chains in the US. It doesn't make much sense at that top level.
Oh,
But if we go deeper and say what might be the logic behind this, and again, this is not the administration now, this is more coming from points made to the president, the much more nuanced model than we've heard about from that top line Truth Social. So his proposal was not 100% tariff. His proposal was a series of events, series of measures that would add some like a 10 to 20% federal tax credit, which could be stuck on top of any tax credits that Georgia or California are offering.
huh.
There would be a requirement that 75% of the production occurred in the US using US labor, that there'd be actually, interestingly, what's called the financial interest and syndication rule. Now, that sounds really complicated, but it's a thing that used to occur that meant that the Hollywood studios couldn't own their own shows. So go back in the days when I was a kid, if you're watching a show on NBC in America, NBC was the network. It couldn't own the show. A separate production company would make it and then sell it to NBC. That folded, but as a consequence, now the streamers kind of own their shows. Like, and no one complains about this particularly, but Netflix owns the Netflix shows that Netflix pays for and makes. And his suggestion was we go back to the old model, which would therefore give the production companies a lot more leverage, because having sold it to, say, NBC, they could then go and sell it to somebody else. And a couple of other things, but two that are really critical is a 120% tariff on any offset tax benefit incentive offered to the film. So now instead of my $40 million film just getting a $40 million 100% tariff, it would say, oh, I got $10 million from the Australian government. And then under this alternative system, you'd say, hey, studio, you made 10 million from the Australian government in some kind of incentives. You have to pay 12 million back to the US government. And that initiative would crush incentives because clearly it's 20% more to get the incentive. So why would you get it?
Hmm.
Um, I guess the last part of that is that it would apply to all media, not just films. It would apply to streamers and it would even apply to YouTube, Facebook, and X.
Oh,
So
wow.
that's kind of interesting.
Wow. I mean, that's fascinating. And I hadn't heard about, that breakdown in the different detail, but it sounds much more implementable to do part or even all of those measures. So if some of those measures were enacted, what sort of impact do you think that would have?
Well, I think there's one other thing that I left off that shopping list, if you like, of suggestions to the administration. Because again, this isn't coming from the US government. This is coming from a special ambassador advising the government. It would be a cultural content test to determine American authenticity. Now, there are two ways that could play out. One is it's a fairly nominal thing that, like the Australian government has, that it's, an important thing to make this film, which lets them exclude anything that they don't like that might be, I don't know, some kind of incredibly inappropriate, hardcore, violent, misogynist, sexist, pornographic thing or something, right? Like it's
Huh.
just think of it as being like a fail safe for us funding something that's totally inappropriate. Or and this is again completely conjecture, it could be used as some kind of uh, litmus test to the Americanness of the values of the content. Now, under that second scenario, people are very concerned. And the argument goes something like this: the current administration and certainly the supporters of the Republican Party in certain sectors have pointed to Hollywood as being characterized as a very left wing leaning bunch of non sort of US Republican supporting people. And they wouldn't be wrong because, in some respects, you've had a lot of examples of people in Hollywood coming out and speaking against both the Republican Party's values and, in particular, the president, not least of which is Robert De Niro, who at Cannes just this last day was very uh, direct in his criticism of the president as being something less than presidential. So, in that environment, the question is raised: would a blanket help to the film industry therefore facilitate some political influence over what kind of films are made? Now, the president has said that's not true, but then others on the right, sorry, on the left, have pointed to, say, Harvard University and a bunch of measures that have been put in place to discuss, if you like, the appropriateness of measures that the administration don't feel are in line with the Republican platforms. So that one's just a huge question mark. It could be trivial or it could be incredibly significant to exerting influence over Hollywood. As for the rest of it, well, the rest of it, it would be really serious, just from an economic point of view, because what we have to accept is that this runaway production phenomenon has been happening for decades. So if you pick a very American company like Disney, who I think we'd all agree, in many respects, has some of the strongest positive American values going in terms of family and entertainment. They own one of the most revered visual effects houses in the world, which is ILM. It's a magnificent company with tremendously capable people who have won dozens and dozens of Academy Awards for their excellence. But ILM now is distributed over the world, and ILM has an office here in Sydney that does terrific work, as it does in London and other places. So if you are shutting down the ability for those facilities to take work from the US, from the mother company, if you like, you would have a dislocation that is hurting those employees of the company, many of whom, but not all, are Australian. But you'd also be hurting the American company because, after all, it's their regional offices that have been doing work, be it London with, Andor or any of the recent Star Wars TV shows, be it Sydney with things. Netflix is now the owner of Animal Logic in Sydney, and it does Netflix animation. So a lot of these big American companies have these distributed hubs that very respectfully and incredibly appropriately contribute to a master production. And shutting those down and imposing this kind of anti incentive system would really disrupt the lives and, of course, the economic models of those satellite companies.
So these proposed reforms have come from, three special advisors to the president, and they've come up with these lists and these options. Do you think that this would have the support of the American film industry, or that a tariff in some way would be supported by the film industry?
So it's a great point. In fact, and it was actually, just to be clear, it was actually just one of the three that we believe did the work. And he spoke to companies, union representatives, and like a lot of people. He really did make a sincere effort to be inclusive in bringing these proposals. And as a result, his proposal has a lot of ground root support because
Huh.
if you're in Los Angeles and you're a filmmaker and you're seeing productions leave, it doesn't just hurt you as a filmmaker, of course it does, but it also hurts the catering companies, the hair and makeup people, the people that have the costumes, the people that have the light rentals, the people that are doing camera rentals. Like all of these associated companies have reduced the number of days that they're actually, you know, notionally being able to bill for in a week. So, of course, you think doing something for the American film industry is a good idea. And California itself, which has a Democratic governor, has advocated for billion-dollar incentives to move production back to Hollywood. So it makes a lot of sense if you are on the street level, as it were. And also, let's face it, these are a really good range of jobs. This industry isn't polluting, it isn't damaging, it isn't destructive, it isn't environment. I mean, it's not necessarily environmentally great at times, but most of the time it's pretty good, right? But they range from blue collar worker jobs right through to PhDs doing visual effects work with the most complicated AI algorithms and difficult computational problems. So so it's a good industry at many levels. It employs a good range of people, and no matter what anybody says, all of those jobs aren't going away with AI overnight. So you could see why you would want to have those jobs. Um, but at the other end of that spectrum, if you were to do a sort of a anecdotal sort of polling of people over the simple 100% tariff that was announced in Truth Social, that has received quite a lot of, let's put it politely, disrespectful mockery because they can't see how it would work. That doesn't make any sense. They don't know what it would be. It doesn't seem to be a sensible plan. So I would say, yes, there is industry support at the ground roots level for the fundamental intent. But then again, there's this additional question that's been raised, which is why does this president particularly want to help out a group that has been traditionally pointed to by the Magna or sort of community as being not one of us? It seems odd that the president would go to great lengths to just help a group that, by many of the commentators' own opinions, is not producing the sort of views that are thought to be conducive with the Republican Party's platforms.
Really interesting point. So, for international filmmaking hubs like Australia and other countries, how should they respond to these tariffs? And how serious, or, not just tariffs, but other potential measures as well? Should they take them seriously? Are they likely to blow over? Do we have a sense of how much they should start making business decisions based on what we've heard so far?
Murray, that is the as they say, the $64,000 question, because you could argue reasonably that we've seen massive sort of swings when it comes to tariffs between what has been announced with kind of a shock and awe moment and then what's materialized later. You could point to there being really quite sort of contrary communications coming out as to what might actually happen that might lead one to say, this is never going to happen, ain't happening, don't worry about it. But by the same token, there are a lot of measures that have materialize, there are significant changes to US policy that have been very swift and decisive and would, I guess, fall into this category. So the problem that we think we face right now is because you can't say, hey, here is a policy that is likely to be enacted, should it be like in our recent elections, there was a clear case that if I elected this party, this was a policy that they were going to implement. If I elected this party, there was a policy that they would implement. If I was voting for, say, the Labor Party, I was probably saying that I'm not going to get nuclear power because that was clearly in the platform of the other party. That gives you a certain amount of uh, clear understanding of what's going to happen, subject, of course, to the election. What we've got now is a situation where no one's really certain what's going to happen. And it's not as if there was some clear political position made before the US election about this that we now would say, well, yeah, that was stated as what if you voted for the Republican Party, this is what you'd get. This has come out of the blue. So we just don't know. And in an environment where you don't know, what tends to happen is that people put productions on pause. So they say, look, I'm not quite sure what's going on here. So instead of greenlighting this right now, I'll just hang back for 3 or 4 months. Now, the nature of the film industry, as you can imagine, it's project based work. So if we've got a production that's in production right now, it's already been greenlit, they're already filming it, and they're already doing the post production, they're going to go ahead. So for the very, very short term, it's business as usual because those things all have to be finished. If I've laid out, $90 million, I need to get it to the box office so I can start getting back some of my 90 million. I'm not going to change tact. But if I'm thinking about the film that comes after that, I might say, yeah, let's not commission the next $100 billion film for a bit because I'm not quite sure how this is going to work out. Let's just hang back for a bit. But it would take 6 months, maybe 9 months before that would sort of filter through into what's happening because people right now have in Sydney, there's quite a lot of work on, but we just don't know whether that work, when it's over, because it's finished its natural cycle of a project, will be replaced by new work. Or when we turn around looking for that new work, it just won't be there because the Hollywood system is just saying, yeah, we're just going to hang back for a bit and see what happens.
So even just the threat of these actions could lead to a pause and slowdown because of the uncertainty it
Yeah.
creates.
It's you're betting really big numbers. I mean, a Hollywood film that costs 150 million to make is probably going to cost another 150 million to market. That's a $300 million layout. And you're just not making those kind of bets if you don't know how things are shaping down and what's going on. And hang on a second, let's just hang back for a second because you're less likely to lose your job if you don't commission the $300 million film for 3 months than if you commission it and it suddenly costs $600 million and you've just blown a ridiculously large amount of your studio's revenue or profitability.
Hmm. So I guess my last question then before I get your by the numbers stat would be, are there any potential business upsides for non-US filmmakers if these tariffs or some of these other measures were imposed? Could there be any plus sides for these businesses?
I would argue that it's all downside, except for there's one consideration. It's not really an upside, but it's a possible consequence, which is that because of this concern about losing out to the withdrawal of American productions, there's been a strong push to reintroduce in Australia a local content minimum. So back in the day, even in commercials, which you wouldn't even think of, but in commercials and on television, you had a minimum amount of Australian content. So, they wanted to bring in 5 Michael Jackson commercials for Pepsi. They had to make some more Pepsi commercials in Australia to balance it. If they wanted to bring in all these movies, they had to have local content so that a TV network could balance that out. And there's been a strong push locally to say, hey, you guys are going to play hardball, then we should play hardball back, but we're not going to get into a financial fight with you. We'll instead impose local quotas that require you to spend whatever it is, 10, 20% of, content made locally. And that would apply to the streamers as much as it would apply to the networks. And that, of course, in one sense, could be good for local actors and certainly smaller budget because those productions that would fill up those hours are unlikely to be Marvel Avenger level movies. They'll be smaller things. But of course, it could also reasonably be seen as a retaliatory strike by US lawmakers who would consider that to be an escalation of a trade war and then come back with some other punitive move. So it's it's unforeseen consequences time. Um,
Huh.
but at the moment, I feel like what we've seen from the federal government, and quite frankly, I'd applaud this, is a conservative response. They've not been quick to provoke the US or to um, publicly what might be considered disrespect the policies. They've taken a wait and see. Now, that's, I think, at a federal level, the appropriate response right now because we really don't know what's going on. But unfortunately, it also feeds this in a world of uncertainty. I'm not going to do much, including I'm not going to commission new films.
Huh. Wow. Very challenging times. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. And I would love to get your by the numbers stat. What have you chosen for us today?
Global content spend.
Okay.
So my question to you is, how much do you think of the well, let me I'll give you two numbers. I'll give you the first one. You can guess the second one. There are 8 companies that I've lumped together based off some work that was done by a colleague, and they represent what you'd call Hollywood studios and streamers. Yeah. These are 8 companies. They're ones that you would know, the Paramounts, the Disney, Warners, Netflix, Apple, Paramount, et cetera. Okay. Take those 8 companies. What percentage of the world's global content spend do you think those 8 Hollywood companies represent? Given that there's so much done in the world, how much is like these 8 companies responsible for?
If it's just based on spend, I don't know, like 80% or something.
Well, that's very generous. Actually, it's 48%. Half the world's spend, sorry, 52%, half the world's spend, slightly over half, is down to these just 8 companies. So if you think about all the production that's done in India, all the production that's done in
Mhm.
China, all the production that's done even in Australia for Australian television, all of the TV shows you watch that are local and that sort of global content, yeah, 8 companies are basically responsible for, about 125-ish billion dollars worth of that global content stuff. Now that's Hollywood companies. So we have Hollywood companies with a large control over the production. But as I said before, it's completely different to where the productions are made, where they're spending their money. But certainly, there is a concentration of power in Hollywood.
Yeah, I was thinking the marketing number for, the big blockbuster films or when you do the marketing internationally and everything, that would just blow everything else out of the water. But I wasn't thinking as much about how much is happening in so many different countries. It's very interesting.
It's a lot of concentration in the hands of a small number of companies. And as I said, they have their own issues. A lot of them, the changing nature of viewing habits, but nevertheless, this is a really complex problem. And I guess my bottom line is, as is many things that we discuss here at the business school, the world is a very nuanced place, and it's really hard to come up with big kind of sledgehammer solutions that will solve a nuanced problem. And I do believe that just a simple 100% tariff is a very sledgehammery problem when you're, really needing to look at a very nuanced problem and come up with very complicated solutions to address it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing your insights. And I think, taking a course with the business school right now is a great idea to help navigate all this uncertainty at the moment as you try, as anyone working in all these creative industries is trying to project what's going to happen and how do you respond. I think working on the strategy and an understanding of that is a great idea. What's the name of the course you run?
Well, I'm actually teaching I teach a lot of stuff in the undergraduate, but if I can just put a plug in, as it were, just this week, we've launched a new, what we nicknamed the digital MBA, but it's an online MBA that is specifically designed to be addressing things that are occurring in the digital age. And that has only just been launched. It's going to start next year. And that's one of the courses that I've been working on. And it's been really interesting coming together to deal with all of these issues, AI, and a lot of the other things that fold into this entire discussion. So we're looking forward to that.
Oh, fantastic. All right. Well, perfect timing. Looking forward to learning more about that and seeing where it gets to. So, as we wrap up, I'd like to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest to our listeners. Our CEO, Dr. Michael Green, is host of the Asia Chessboard podcast, and I'd also recommend checking out the USSC Live podcast series that runs recordings from our major live events, including our recent event on the first 100 days of the second Trump administration. And our recordings from the 2024 Sydney International Strategy Forum are live there as well. You can find these on our website at ussc.edu.au or wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, Mike, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.